This time, we have to take the time to do something. And this time, it's time for the Senate to do something.
Do something. That's the refrain we constantly hear after every mass shooting. Inevitably, the anti-gun crowd calls for more background checks, stricter control over so-called assault weapons, or more gun-free zones. But few people take the time to determine if the gun control measures being proposed would work to prevent crime or mass shootings. Thankfully, one man has actually done the work, looked at the data. John Lott is the author of More Guns, Less Crime and the president of the Crime Prevention Research Center. He joins me now. John, thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me on, Buck.
So, John, you literally wrote the book on the issue of crime and gun control. I want to go through some of the more common gun control measures and, honestly, gun control myths that we hear about. Let's start with gun-free zones, right? The idea here that the left puts forward is gun-free zones prevent gun crimes. What does the data tell us?
Right. But I mean, let me first of all say for over 20 years, I've wanted to go and do something. I find it very frustrating. Unfortunately, I think the types of proposals that gun control advocates and people like President Biden put out will actually either make things worse or have no impact. One thing that I think would make a huge difference is getting rid of these gun-free zones. 96% of the successful mass public shootings keep on occurring in places where guns are banned. I understand what's hoped for here. The notion is you simply go and ban guns from certain areas, then you won't have gun crimes in those areas. Unfortunately, I think this is one example where the opposite happens, that when you go and you ban guns in certain places, the most law-abiding good citizens who obey that, and rather than deterring criminals from going and committing crimes in those places, it actually serves as a magnet for them to go and commit crimes in it. Just look at the last few attacks that we've had. The Tulsa hospital shooting was a gun-free zone. The school in Texas was a gun-free zone. 30% of the schools in Texas actually have armed teachers and staff, but this wasn't one of them. You look at the Buffalo grocery store shooter. If people actually go and read the murderer's manifesto there, he actually talks about how he picked the particular target that he did. He wanted to go to a place where he knew the civilians there would not have permanent concealed handguns for protection because it would make his job so much more difficult. And he's not the only one. We have many cases where we've gone through diaries or manifestos or other things that these murderers in these mass public shootings have left over time. These people may be crazy in some sense, but they're not stupid. Their goal is to try to kill as many people as possible. And if they go to a place where victims aren't able to go and defend themselves, they're going to be more successful. I mean, let me put it to you this way. Let's say, God forbid, somebody was stalking you or your family, was really seriously threatening you. Would you feel safer putting a sign in front of your home that said your home is a gun-free zone? Do you think that if the attacker went up to the house and he said, well, there are no guns allowed in this place, so I'm not going to take my weapon in there, that that's somehow going to deter him? If anything, it'd have the opposite impact. He would know that people in there weren't able to defend themselves. Look at the penalty that you face for taking a gun into a gun-free zone like a school. You face an additional 2 or 3 years in prison. If somebody's going to go and kill 21 people in that place, already facing 21 life sentences or 21 death penalties, do you really think an additional 2 or 3 year sentence is going to be, well, that's going to be what's going to keep him from going and committing that crime? It's just ridiculous. These guys want to kill as many people as possible, and they know if they go to a place where victims can't defend themselves, they're going to be able to go and kill more people. Their goal is to try to get media coverage. I'll give you an example. You look at the Sandy Hook killer. He had done what police described as essentially a doctoral dissertation where he had looked at mass shootings over the previous 40 years, not only in the United States, but attacks around the world. And he apparently had graphed out the relationship between the number of people killed in attacks and the amount of media coverage it got. And his goal, according to one police report, was to go and kill more people than the Norway killer had killed, because Norway killer at that time, this was before the Paris attack, had killed the most people in a mass public shooting. And he believed that if he could only kill more people than the Norway person who killed 67 people with a gun, that he could get even more worldwide media attention.
John, I want to also ask you about another gun control myth, the idea that just aggregate gun ownership, effectively, the more people who own guns, the more crime there is with guns. Legal gun ownership we're talking about here. What can you tell us about that?
Well, that's simply not true. I mean, I'll give you a simple statistic, and that is there are a number of places around the world, not just in the United States, that have either tried to ban all guns or all handguns. People are familiar with the experiences in Chicago and Washington, D.C. And yet, every single place that's banned either all guns or all handguns has seen an increase in murder rates afterwards. You think out of randomness, once or twice, you'd at least get the murder rates and homicide rates to go down or at least stay the same. But yet every single time it goes up, often by large amounts. Now, in the cases of Chicago and Washington, D.C., gun control advocates will say, well, that really wasn't a fair test because unless you go and ban guns, every place in the country, criminals will still get guns from the rest of Illinois or from Indiana or from Maryland or Virginia. You know, the thing is, one, it would have been nice if they had told us to begin with that they thought that the experiment was going to fail. But two, the problem that you face is that there are countries around the world that have banned either all guns or all handguns. You have island nations that have done that, that don't have a neighbor that they can easily go and blame for supplying the guns. And yet you see the same type of pattern, whether it be Jamaica or Ireland or the UK. And the reason is pretty simple. And that is when you go and you ban guns, you may make it somewhat more difficult for some criminals to get guns. But it's primarily going to be the most law-abiding good citizens who obey the law and turn in their guns. And if you disarm law-abiding citizens relative to criminals, you actually make it easier for criminals to go and commit crimes. They have less to worry about than doing it, and they become bolder in terms of committing those types of crimes. But, you know, again, there are other ways you can look at it. I personally find looking at lots of different places over time a lot more convincing. You know, one of the things that people will make comparisons with is they'll say, look at the United Kingdom and the United States. The United Kingdom has very few homicides compared to the United States, and they have extremely strict gun control laws. Many types of guns like handguns and rifles are banned, and yet they have a lower homicide rate. So it must be the strict gun control laws that cause the lower homicide rate. In fact, if you look before they had the gun control laws there, they had even lower homicide rates relative to the United States. That their homicide rates went up. They still may be lower than the rate in the United States, but they went up relative to what they had been before when they had those types of strict gun control laws that were there. And, you know, I could go on just making other types of comparisons across places, but I think it's pretty clear that when you look at the data correctly, that there's a very clear relationship. Look, police are extremely important. Anybody who's read my work knows that I think police are the single most important factor for reducing crime. But the police themselves know that they virtually always arrive on the crime scene after the crimes occurred. And the question is, what's the safest course of action for people to take? And police,
John,
by the way,
I want to get into this with you some more. If we can just take a moment here, we'll come back into that issue and more of the gun control myths that are out there in just a moment.
Sure.
It's hard to talk about gun control without discussing the left's favorite target of it, AR-15s, so-called assault weapons. After the break, we'll separate fact from fiction behind America's most popular rifle in this special edition of Hold the Line. Stay with us.
So, listen, I think there's a difference between what we should be doing and what is reasonable to expect from this Congress. What we should be doing is taking these weapons of war out of the hands of civilians.
In 1994, then President Bill Clinton signed the federal assault weapons ban, which prohibited the manufacture, transfer, or possession of semi-automatic assault weapons, including the AR-15 and AK-47. The ban expired in 2004, and gun control proponents like Senator Chris Murphy have been trying to get it back on the books ever since. But what would another assault weapons ban actually mean for crime in this country? Joining me once again is the author of More Guns, Less Crime and the president of the Crime Prevention Research Center, John Lott. John, thanks for staying with us.
Thank you.
Let's start with definitions. We hear the AR-15 and similar rifles being called weapons of war. How does the government actually define an assault weapon?
Well, I mean, with the original assault weapons ban, you had Senator Dianne Feinstein's staff go through and look through catalogs of guns and essentially put check marks next to guns that they thought looked particularly scary. They also had a definition where if guns had two or more of a different combination, like threaded barrels, or could hold a bayonet or a grenade launcher or other things. If they had two or more of these different characteristics, then the guns would be banned. Look, I mean, there's been a lot of academic research that's been done. There's been research that was even paid for by the Clinton administration that simply hasn't found any beneficial impact in terms of any type of violent crime or any type of mass public shooting. There's a simple reason for that. Simply banning guns based on how they look. I mean, they often refer to these as military style weapons, where the key word is style. Look, I mean, if you talked about banning guns based upon how they function, it might make some sense. There are three different types of guns out there generally when you're talking about rifles. There's manually loaded guns, where you pull a trigger, a bullet comes out, and then you have to physically yourself put another bullet in the chamber. You have semi-automatic guns, where one pull the trigger, one bullet comes out, the gun reloads itself, one pull the trigger, one bullet comes out, and so on. And then you have fully automatic guns, machine guns, where as long as you have the trigger depressed, bullets are going to come out. We're not talking about machine guns here, despite many times the media refers to them as that. We're talking about semi-automatic guns. 85% of the handguns sold in the United States are semi-automatic guns. A very similar percentage of rifles in the United States are semi-automatic guns. So the vast majority, and if you're using a gun defensively, having a semi-automatic gun can be very beneficial. If you're facing more than one attacker and have to fire the gun more than once, or you fire and miss, or you fire and wound but don't incapacitate the attacker, you may be very thankful that the gun quickly reloads itself. If you have to manually put another bullet in the chamber, you may not have the luxury of time to go and fire the gun again. But here's the deal with the AR-15s. They're essentially hunting rifles that just look on the outside like a military weapon. No military in the world uses these guns. In fact, they're considered small caliber hunting rifles. 0.223 tells you the diameter of the bullet. It's a little bit over 0.22 inches in diameter. People may be familiar with 22 caliber rifles that are there. They know that in any type of mass production, that's the most common small caliber bullet that you have. In fact, most states won't allow you to use an AR-15 to go and hunt deer because the concern that the caliber isn't large enough to make sure that you'll kill the deer. It's more likely that you'll just end up wounding the deer that's there. And they don't want the deer to run off and suffer someplace. But look, to go and ban
John, let me ask, because you touched on this, the Biden administration line on this is he will say, we know what works. And he'll say, specifically, Joe Biden will say, I was a part of what worked, which was this 1994 assault weapons ban. What data do they point to? I mean, I think they say, well, there were fewer mass shootings after this. Was that true?
Well, okay. You may if you look at mass public shootings, you may, depending upon which data set that you look at and how it's defined, you may find a drop of 1 or 2, in terms of the rate in the 10 years before versus the 10 years after, or you may find you see no change in terms of the number of attacks with assault weapons. it's not statistically significant. It's very tiny, even if you use the data sets that they want with the way that they want to go and selectively define the things that are there. But even if you use the data sets and the way they want to use it, there's another way to look at it, and that is to go and look at the percent of mass public shootings involving assault weapons. So even if you take their numbers, okay, the way that they want, what you find is that the percentage of attacks using assault weapons actually rose during the time that there was the assault weapons ban and fell afterwards. So if the ban is going to be responsible for any drop, no matter how tiny it is, then surely the share of attacks using assault weapons is going to have to fall over that period of time. And the opposite is true, because there's no way it's going to be driving the drop in the total if you don't have a relatively bigger drop in the number of attacks with assault weapons that are there. And so, I can't tell you the number. There's been dozens of studies that have been done looking at this. There's one guy named Lagribus, who's a professor at a teaching college at Columbia, who's done work on this. He has his own definition of these things, different from Mother Jones and myself and others that have put together these types of data. And he's the one that they cite. But even if you use his work, it's not a statistically significant drop. It's like a drop of like 1 or 2 between those periods of time. And even with his, the share of attacks with assault weapons goes up during the ban and then falls when the ban ends.
So, John, I got to ask you before we close here, what does your extensive research, many years on this topic, tell you and therefore all of us about what would actually be effective at reducing violence with firearms in America? What actually helps bring that down?
Well, it's not rocket science. You want to make it risky for people to go and commit crimes. If you want to, first of all, people need to know that less than 8% of violent crime involves guns. Okay. I know Biden wants to talk about violent crime as solely a gun problem there. But the way you reduce violent crime generally is the same way that you reduce violent crime with guns. You have higher arrest rates, higher conviction rates. So when Biden went to New York in February for his 4th big speech on violent crime, if it were me, I would have had a Sister Soldier type moment. I would have said, look, you guys cut the police budget by $1 billion a year. Is it surprising you get more crime? You have district attorneys who are refusing to prosecute violent criminals. You have over half the inmates being released from local jails during this period of time. You have bail reform so that violent criminals are being let out on no bail. Here you have people that have committed attempted murder, okay, who have facing multiple felonies, who are going to be facing decades in jail if they're convicted. And you let them out on no bail. What's their cost for doing another crime? I mean, if you're already facing 25 or 30 years potential prison term, what am I going to do? Is the second life sentence I'm going to give you going to be the sentence that's going to make it so you're not going to...
So law enforcement and basically the opposite of the trajectory of the progressive prosecutors and the Democrat and mass incarceration line we've been hearing for years. John, always appreciate your work. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for being there. Getting rid of gun-free zones with regard to mass public shootings, but thank you for being there.
Thank you.